Jack Turner had been running the only traditional bakery at Nexus Prime Spaceport for 3 years, and he'd learned that homesick travelers from across the galaxy all craved the same thing, fresh bread that reminded them of home, whether it was a Rigelian trader missing the grain cakes of his homeworld, or an World, or an Oz, Andromedan engineer longing for the crystalline loaves her grandmother used to make. Everyone seemed to have childhood memories connected to the smell of baking dough, but the customer who walked into Turner's traditional bakery on a busy Tuesday morning was different. Iris Vex-9, a Zephyrian systems analyst who worked in the spaceport's traffic control center, approached his counter with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered food a necessary fuel rather than a source of comfort. Human baker, Iris announced, her translucent blue features shifting to patterns that indicated professional impatience. I require carbohydrate provisions for a 72-hour shift rotation. Provide your most efficient nutritional options. Jack looked up from the sourdough starter he'd been feeding, a culture that had been alive for over 200 years, passed down through 5 generations of his family, and smiled at the Zephyrian's businesslike approach to breakfast. Good morning to you too, Iris. How about I start you with something that'll actually taste good, instead of something that just meets your caloric requirements? Iris's gaseous form flickered with what Jack had learned to recognize as mild irritation. Baker Turner, I do not consume food for recreational purposes. I require optimal fuel for extended computational work. Right, but what if I told you that the right bread can actually improve your cognitive function? My grandmother always said that proper fermentation creates compounds that help with mental clarity and sustained energy. Your grandmother was not a biochemist qualified to make claims about nutritional neurochemistry. Jack had been having variations of this conversation with Iris for 6 months. The Zephyrian stopped by his bakery every few days, ordered the most basic, utilitarian food items available, and dismissed any suggestion that food could be anything more than efficient biological maintenance. Maybe not, Jack agreed, pulling a fresh loaf of his specialty herb bread from the cooling rack. But she fed a family of farmers who worked 16-hour days for 60 years, and they all stayed sharp and healthy well into their 80s. Sometimes practical experience teaches you things that laboratory analysis misses. Iris was consulting her handheld scanner, analyzing the molecular composition of the bread Jack was offering. This loaf contains 23% more complex carbohydrates than your standard offerings, along with elevated levels of B vitamins and trace minerals. Explain the production methodology that achieved these nutritional enhancements. Jack paused in his bread slicing, realizing that Iris was asking about his great-grandmother's recipe with the same analytical intensity she probably brought to debugging spaceport navigation systems. It's the fermentation process. Instead of using commercial yeast that works fast, I use a sourdough starter that's been alive for generations. The long, slow fermentation breaks down proteins and starches in ways that make them more bioavailable. Plus, the wild yeasts and bacteria in the culture produce vitamins and compounds that you can't get from factory bread. Define wild yeasts and bacteria, microorganisms that occur naturally in flour and air. They form symbiotic communities that ferment grain into bread while creating beneficial byproducts. It's like biological software that's been debugging itself for thousands of years. Iris's form shifted to a brighter blue that Jack was learning to associate with sudden technical interest. You are describing naturally evolved biological algorithms that optimize nutritional outcomes through iterative fermentation processes. I'm describing how to make really good bread using methods my great-great-grandmother learned from her mother. But if that's how you want to think about it, sure, demonstrate this process. Jack looked at the Zephyrian, whose gaseous form was now pulsing with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for critical system diagnostics. Iris, you want to see how I make bread? I want to observe the biological algorithms you described. If naturally evolved fermentation processes can optimize nutritional bioavailability through symbiotic microorganism communities, this represents computational methodology that could have applications beyond food production. Jack wasn't entirely sure what Iris was talking about, but he recognized genuine curiosity when he saw it. Okay, but it takes time. Real bread can't be rushed. Define time in this context. Well, feeding the starter and preparing the dough takes about an hour. Then the first fermentation is 4 to 6 hours. Shaping and proofing is another 2 hours. And baking takes 40 minutes. So about 8 to 10 hours total. Iris's form flickered with what appeared to be dismay. Your biological algorithm requires 10 hours to complete a single optimization cycle? It requires 10 hours to create something that'll be perfect. You can make bread faster, but it won't have the same complexity, nutrition, or flavor. Explain how extended processing time improves output quality. Jack found himself in the unusual position of describing bread making to someone who thought about it like computer programming. The starter contains dozens of different microorganisms, each with different optimal conditions and processing speeds. The slow fermentation gives them time to work in sequence. Some break down proteins first. Others convert starches. Others produce acids that improve texture and preservation. Rush the process, and you lose most of the beneficial interactions. So your grandmother's recipe represents a naturally evolved, multi-stage biological algorithm that optimizes nutritional and gustatory outputs through sequential microorganism processing. Iris, my grandmother's recipe makes really good bread because she learned from people who had been making bread for hundreds of generations, and they figured out what worked best through trial and error. But Iris was no longer listening to Jack's explanation. Her attention had been captured by his sourdough starter, which was bubbling gently in its glass jar as the wild yeasts processed fresh flour and water. This culture, it is alive? Very much alive. It's basically a balanced ecosystem in a jar. I feed it every day, and it keeps producing the right conditions for fermentation. It produces waste products. It produces carbon dioxide, which makes the bread rise, and organic acids, which create flavor and help preserve the bread, plus dozens of other compounds that contribute to nutrition and taste. Iris moved closer to examine the starter, her gaseous form shifting to patterns Jack had never seen before. Baker Turner, I believe your biological algorithm may contain solutions to problems that have been challenging our advanced technological systems. What kind of problems? The Traffic Control Center has been experiencing cascading failures in our navigation software. Complex computational processes that should run smoothly are becoming unstable and producing unreliable outputs. Our best programmers cannot determine why systems that worked perfectly for years are now malfunctioning. Jack stirred his starter and added fresh flour, watching the culture bubble with renewed activity. What kind of malfunctions? Calculation, errors, processing delays, complete system crashes during high traffic periods. Every attempt to fix the problems with more sophisticated programming creates new instabilities. Sounds like you're overcomplicating things. I do not understand that assessment. Jack looked at Iris, who was studying his bread-making process with the intensity of someone trying to solve a critical technical problem. In baking, when something stops working right, it's usually because you've interfered with natural processes that were already functioning well. Like, if you try to speed up fermentation with additives, you disrupt the balance between different microorganisms and end up with bread that doesn't rise properly. You are suggesting that our software failures are caused by excessive optimization attempts? I'm suggesting that sometimes when you try to improve something that's already working, you break the things that were making it work in the first place. Iris's form was now pulsing rapidly, indicating intense cognitive processing. Baker Turner, would you be willing to observe our software systems and apply your biological algorithm analysis methodology to our technical problems? Jack paused in his bread preparation, trying to process what Iris was asking. You want me to look at spaceport navigation software? I want you to apply the same diagnostic approach you use for fermentation optimization to our computational optimization challenges. Iris, I don't know anything about computer programming or navigation systems, but you understand stable biological processes, symbiotic system interactions, and the effects of excessive intervention on naturally balanced algorithms. Jack looked at his sourdough starter, which was thriving through processes he understood practically, but couldn't explain technically. Then at Iris, who was facing technical problems that her advanced knowledge couldn't solve. You really think bread making has something to teach you about computer programming? I think your great-grandmother's algorithm represents successful optimization methodology that our advanced technical approaches have failed to achieve. As Jack agreed to visit the traffic control center after his morning baking was finished, he realized that his simple family bakery was about to become involved in solving problems that affected interstellar navigation throughout the galaxy. Sometimes, the oldest solutions were exactly what the most advanced technology needed. That afternoon, Jack found himself in the Nexus Prime Traffic Control Center, surrounded by holographic displays, quantum processors, and technology so advanced he couldn't identify half the equipment. But what struck him most was the chaos alarms beeping, technicians running between stations, and a palpable sense of barely controlled panic. "The situation has deteriorated since this morning," Iris announced, her gaseous form shifting to deep red patterns that indicated high stress levels. "We've had 3 near-collision events, 2 cargo ships redirected to emergency docks, and complete system failure in the outer ring navigation grid." Jack watched the massive wall display, showing hundreds of ships moving through 3-dimensional space around the spaceport, their paths coordinated by software systems that were clearly struggling to keep up with the traffic. Chief Navigator Creelix, Iris called to a tall Rigelian whose tentacles were manipulating multiple control interfaces simultaneously. "This is Baker Turner, the human I mentioned who understands biological algorithm optimization." Creelix paused in his frantic system management to acknowledge Jack with barely concealed skepticism. "Systems Analyst Iris, with respect, we are facing critical software failures that require immediate technical solutions, not consultation with food service personnel." Chief Navigator, I believe Baker Turner's expertise with naturally stable processing systems may provide insights that our conventional approaches have not achieved. Jack looked around the control center, noting the similarity between what he was seeing and problems he'd encountered in his bakery. "Iris, can you show me what the software was supposed to do originally before the problem started?" "Certainly." Iris activated a holographic display showing the navigation system's basic architecture: elegant, streamlined, with clean data flows between different processing modules. "And what does it look like now?" Iris activated a second display showing the current system state, the same basic architecture, but now overlaid with dozens of additional modules, patches, modifications, and redundant processing layers. "I see the problem," Jack said immediately. The entire control center went quiet as technicians turned to stare at the baker, who had just claimed to diagnose in 30 seconds what their best programmers hadn't solved in months. "Explain your analysis," Chief Navigator Creelix demanded. "You've overkneaded your dough." "I beg your pardon?" Jack moved closer to the holographic displays, pointing at the layers of modifications and patches. "In bread making, when dough isn't working right, the natural instinct is to keep working it, more kneading, more additives, more intervention. But overworking breaks down the gluten structure and disrupts the fermentation process. The more you try to fix it, the worse it gets." "Baker Turner, this is advanced computational software, not baking ingredients. But the principle is the same. Your original system was working fine, clean, simple, stable. Then when problems started, you added fixes. When those fixes created new problems, you added more fixes. Now you've got so many modifications and patches that the system can't function naturally." Iris was studying the system displays with growing recognition. "Baker Turner is describing exactly our development process. Each attempted optimization has required additional supporting modifications, creating increasingly complex interdependencies." "Right. In baking, when you've overkneaded dough, you can't fix it by kneading more. You have to start over with fresh ingredients and gentler handling." Chief Navigator Creelix's tentacles were arranged in patterns indicating professional skepticism. "Baker Turner, are you suggesting that we abandon months of advanced programming work and revert to our original problematic system?" "I'm suggesting that your original system probably wasn't actually problematic. It was probably just being asked to do more than it was designed for. So instead of modifying the system, you should modify what you're asking it to do." Iris moved to a different display showing traffic volume data over the past year. "Baker Turner, observe these metrics. Navigation requests have increased by 340% since our original software implementation. The system failures began when traffic exceeded our original design parameters. So you tried to make your software handle more than it was built for, and when that created problems, you kept adding patches to force it to work. Correct assessment. Jack looked around the control center at the stressed technicians and failing systems. In my bakery, when I have more orders than my ovens can handle, I don't try to modify my ovens to bake faster. That just burns the bread. I either add more ovens or find ways to manage the workload that work with my existing equipment's natural capabilities. Explain the practical application of this principle to our navigation challenges. Jack studied the traffic flow displays, thinking about how he managed busy periods in his bakery. Instead of trying to process all navigation requests with one overloaded system, why not create multiple simple systems that each handle part of the workload? We have attempted distributed processing approaches, but coordinating multiple systems has created additional complexity and points of failure because you're trying to coordinate them like they're all parts of one big system. What if they operated independently, like separate bakeries in the same neighborhood? Chief Navigator Creolix was consulting his technical specifications with visible confusion. Baker Turner, how would independent navigation systems prevent conflicts and collisions? The same way multiple bakeries in a city avoid conflicts by specializing and communicating basic information without trying to control each other's operations. Jack moved to the traffic display and began sketching zones with his finger. What if you divided the space around the spaceport into districts, with each district managed by its own simple navigation system? Ships entering District A only interact with System A, which handles basic routing and collision avoidance for that area. When a ship needs to move to District B, System A just hands off to System B with minimal coordination. That approach would require ships to follow predetermined routes rather than optimized paths. Right, like how streets work in a city. Not every route is perfectly optimized, but the system is stable and predictable. Sometimes good enough is better than perfect, if perfect doesn't actually work. Iris was manipulating the holographic displays, modeling Jack's suggestion. Baker Turner's district-based approach would eliminate the computational complexity that has been causing our system failures. But it would also eliminate the efficiency optimizations that advanced path planning algorithms provide. Chief Navigator Creolix protested. Chief Navigator, Jack said gently, what good are efficiency optimizations if the system crashes every few hours and nearly causes collisions? The control center fell quiet as the implications of Jack's question settled over. The assembled technicians. You are suggesting that we prioritize system stability over computational sophistication? Creolix asked. I'm suggesting that the most sophisticated system is the one that works reliably when you need it most. Iris was now modeling the district-based navigation approach on multiple displays, showing how simple, independent systems could handle the same traffic volume without the complexity that was causing failures. Colleagues, Baker Turner's methodology would reduce our navigation system complexity by approximately 70% while maintaining functional capacity for current traffic volumes. And it would be stable? Chief Navigator Creolix asked. Like a sourdough starter, Jack replied. Simple, reliable, and self-maintaining. But their conversation was interrupted when the primary navigation system crashed completely, triggering emergency protocols throughout the control center. All inbound traffic is being diverted to emergency holding patterns, announced an Andromedan technician whose crystalline features were flashing urgent red. We have complete system failure on primary navigation control. How long until the backup systems come online? Chief Navigator Creolix demanded. Backup systems are also experiencing instability. Estimated restoration time is 4 to 6 hours. Jack looked at the wall display, showing hundreds of ships now circling in holding patterns, burning fuel and blocking traffic throughout the sector. Iris, how fast could you implement a basic version of the district system? A minimal implementation could be operational within 30 minutes, but it would lack the advanced features that could it safely guide ships to dock without crashes or collisions? Yes, but then let's do it. As Iris began rapidly programming a simplified navigation system based on Jack Baker's understanding of managing multiple operations simultaneously, Jack realized that his family's bread-making wisdom was about to be tested on problems that affected interstellar commerce throughout the galaxy. Sometimes the most advanced solutions were the ones that admitted there were limits to how much complexity actually helped Dot over the next 4 hours. Jack watched Iris work with an intensity he'd never seen from the usually efficient Zephyrian. She was implementing his district-based navigation concept, but adapting it with technical knowledge that transformed his simple bakery analogies into functional interstellar. Traffic management. District A operational, Iris announced, her gaseous form now pulsing with steady blue patterns that indicated deep focus. Accepting inbound cargo vessels for docking bays 1 to 15. How is it handling the traffic? Jack asked, watching the display show ships smoothly following predetermined routes rather than optimized paths. Perfectly stable. No computational errors. No system delays. No conflicts. Iris paused in her programming to look at Jack directly. Baker Turner, your methodology is producing superior results to our previous advanced optimization approaches. Chief Navigator Creelix was monitoring the system performance with expressions of professional amazement mixed with wounded pride. The efficiency metrics are 23% lower than our optimized routing algorithms, but the reliability is approaching 100%. Chief Navigator, which would you rather have, perfect efficiency that crashes every few hours, or good efficiency that works consistently? When stated in those terms, the choice is obvious. Over the following days, Jack found himself spending more time in the traffic control center than in his bakery, working with Iris to refine the district-based navigation system. But what surprised him most wasn't the technical collaboration. It was discovering that beneath Iris's analytical exterior was someone who approached problems with the same methodical patience that made great bread. Your biological algorithm methodology is more sophisticated than I initially assessed, Iris said during one of their late-night system optimization sessions. The principle of minimal intervention for maximum stability represents advanced systems theory. Jack was kneading dough for the next day's bread while simultaneously consulting on navigation software. Combination of activities he'd never imagined possible. Iris, I don't think of bread making as systems theory. I think of it as taking care of living things. The starter is alive, the dough is alive, and if you pay attention to what they need, they'll do most of the work for you. But that attentiveness requires extensive knowledge about biological processes, environmental factors, and optimal conditions for different microorganisms. It requires paying attention and caring about the outcome. The specific knowledge comes from experience and from learning when things go wrong. Iris was quiet for several minutes, processing this perspective on expertise and problem solving. Baker Turner, may I ask you something unrelated to navigation systems? Sure. Why did you choose food service as your profession? Your analytical capabilities suggest you could have pursued advanced technical careers. Jack looked at the Zephyrian, realizing that in all their months of brief interactions, they'd never had a personal conversation. I didn't choose baking because I couldn't do something else. I chose it because I love feeding people, and because bread connects people to traditions, families, and memories in ways that most other work doesn't. You derive satisfaction from the emotional responses of your customers. I derive satisfaction from being part of something that's been bringing people together for thousands of years. When someone tastes bread that reminds them of their grandmother's kitchen, I'm participating in a connection that spans generations. Iris's form shifted to softer blue patterns that Jack was learning to associate with contemplation rather than analysis. I have never considered food consumption as a form of cultural continuity. Really? Your species doesn't have traditional foods that connect you to your history. Zephyrians consume gaseous nutrients that are optimized for our physiological requirements. We do not have emotional associations with sustenance. Jack paused in his bread kneading, realizing that Iris had been approaching food the same way she approached everything else, as a technical problem to be optimized rather than an experience to be appreciated. Iris, would you like to try understanding bread from a different perspective? Explain your proposal. Instead of analyzing my starter as a biological algorithm, what if you experienced it as a living community that you're responsible for taking care of? Iris moved closer to Jack's sourdough jar, which was bubbling quietly as the wild yeasts processed their evening feeding. I do not understand how to experience a microbial culture. Start by thinking of it as a pet. It needs food, water, the right temperature, and attention. If you take care of it, it will take care of you by making bread possible. A pet that produces functional outputs in exchange for maintenance inputs. A pet that becomes part of your daily routine because you care about its well-being, and because taking care of it becomes a form of meditation or relaxation. Jack guided Iris through the process of feeding the starter, measuring flour and water, stirring gently, observing the culture's response to fresh nutrients. The microorganisms are responding to the feeding by increasing metabolic activity, Iris observed. They're happy you fed them. They are not capable of emotional states. Maybe not the way you understand emotions, but they're thriving because you provided what they needed, and that thriving makes tomorrow's bread possible. Isn't that a form of relationship? Iris was quiet for a long time, watching the starter bubble with renewed activity after its feeding. Baker Turner, I have been analyzing your navigation methodology incorrectly. How so? I assumed your success derived from technical insights about system optimization. But your approach is based on caring about the well-being of the systems you work with. Jack looked at the traffic control center's displays, where ships were moving safely through the district-based navigation system that Iris had built based on his bread-making philosophy. I guess that's right. When I make bread, I'm not trying to optimize biological algorithms. I'm trying to create conditions where natural processes can work effectively. And when you advised modifications to our navigation systems, you were not optimizing computational efficiency. You were creating conditions where our existing systems could function without stress. I was trying to help you stop fighting against your equipment and start working with it. Iris's form shifted to the brightest blue Jack had ever seen from her, a color that seemed to indicate not just understanding, but appreciation. Baker Turner, your methodology has taught me something that advanced technical training did not provide. What's that? That the most sophisticated approach to complex problems is often to care about the well-being of the systems involved rather than trying to control their performance. Over the following weeks, Jack noticed changes in Iris that went beyond their professional collaboration on navigation systems. She began visiting his bakery not just for efficient nutrition, but to observe the bread-making process and to help with feeding the sourdough starter. The culture appears more active today, she would observe, noting subtle changes in the starter's behavior that indicated healthy fermentation. That's because the weather's been warm and humid, perfect conditions for the wild yeasts. So environmental factors affect biological performance, even in controlled settings. Everything affects everything else. That's why you can't optimize one part of a system without considering how it impacts all the other parts. These conversations led to improvements in the navigation system that neither of them had anticipated. By understanding bread making as a holistic process rather than a collection of optimizable variables, Iris began to see traffic control as a living system that required balance rather than just efficiency. Baker Turner, I want to show you something, Iris said during one of their collaborative sessions. She activated a new display showing traffic flow patterns over the past month, smooth, stable, with significantly fewer delays and no system crashes. These metrics represent the most reliable navigation performance in Nexus Prime's operational history. That's great, Iris. You should be proud of the work you've done. The work we have done, your methodology, provided the foundational insights that made these improvements possible. Jack looked at the data showing thousands of ships safely guided to their destinations by systems based on bread-making principles. Then at Iris, whose analytical nature had learned to incorporate care and attention into technical problem-solving. Iris, I need to tell you something. Yes, when you first started coming to my bakery, I thought you were just another customer who didn't understand that food could be more than fuel. But working with you has taught me that analytical thinking and caring about outcomes aren't opposite approaches. They're complementary skills that work better together. Baker Turner, you have taught me that technical expertise becomes most valuable when it serves the well-being of the systems and people it's meant to help. As their collaboration continued to produce innovations that combined Jack's practical wisdom with Iris's technical knowledge, both realized that their partnership had evolved into something neither had expected, a friendship based on mutual respect for different types of expertise and shared commitment to to creating solutions that actually worked. Sometimes the most important discoveries emerged from people who were willing to learn from each other instead of just trying to prove their own approaches were superior. 3 months after, Jack's bread-making philosophy had revolutionized Nexus Prime's navigation systems. Their success attracted attention that neither of them had anticipated. The Galactic Traffic Management Consortium had sent a delegation to evaluate their methodology for implementation across all major spaceports in the known galaxy. The statistical improvements are unprecedented, announced Director Veltar Stormweaver, whose crystalline Andromedan features reflected the control center's holographic displays as she reviewed performance metrics. Navigation efficiency up 45%. System stability improved by 89%. Near-collision incidents reduced to 0 over the past 90 days. Jack stood beside Iris in the traffic control center, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the attention their collaboration was receiving from officials, who seemed more interested in quantifying their success than understanding how they'd achieved it. Director Stormweaver, Iris replied with her characteristic analytical precision. These improvements resulted from applying biological stability principles to computational system design, guided by Baker Turner's expertise in managing naturally balanced processes. Yes, we're particularly interested in understanding how a food service worker was able to solve technical problems that had challenged our best programmers. Jack felt the familiar tension that arose when people described his contributions in ways that either diminished his expertise or inflated it beyond recognition. Director, I didn't solve programming problems. I just shared some principles about working with systems that are already functional instead of trying to force them to be something they're not. Director Stormweaver consulted her evaluation documentation with the expression of someone trying to categorize discoveries that didn't fit established frameworks. Mr. Turner, regardless of your modest characterization, your methodology has produced results that suggest applications far beyond this single spaceport. We want to implement your approach throughout the consortium's network. What would that involve? Comprehensive documentation of your techniques, standardization of implementation protocols, and training programs for technical personnel across 47 star systems. Jack looked at Iris, whose gaseous form was shifting to patterns he'd learned to associate with concern rather than excitement. Director Stormweaver, Jack said carefully, I'm not sure my approach can be standardized the way you're describing. Explain your concerns, Mr. Turner. The bread-making principles that helped with your navigation systems work because they're adapted to specific conditions. The local environment, the particular equipment, the people involved. If you tried to turn them into universal protocols, they'll probably stop working. Director Stormweaver was documenting Jack's response with visible skepticism. Mr. Turner, successful methodologies must be scalable for broad implementation. Individual customization is not compatible with galactic standardization requirements. But individual customization is exactly what makes the methodology work. You can't apply my great-grandmother's bread recipe in a place with different flour, different water, different climate, and expect the same results. You have to adapt the principles to local conditions. Chief Navigator Creelix, who had become a strong advocate for Jack's approach, stepped forward to support his explanation. Director Stormweaver, Baker Turner's methodology succeeds precisely because it responds to specific system characteristics rather than imposing universal solutions. Standardization might eliminate the adaptability that makes his approach effective. But their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Magnus Coldwell from the Galactic Engineering Standards Authority, whose presence indicated that Jack's unorthodox success had attracted regulatory attention. Director Stormweaver, colleagues, I must express serious concerns about the experimental systems being operated at this facility. Jack felt his stomach sink as he recognized the tone of institutional opposition that had become familiar during his collaboration with Iris. Dr. Coldwell, what specific concerns would you like to address? Mr. Turner's navigation systems violate established engineering protocols by prioritizing stability over optimization, using simplified rather than advanced algorithms, and incorporating non-technical decision-making criteria into critical safety systems. But the systems work better than the previous approaches, Jack protested. Mr. Turner, Compliance with engineering standards is more important than individual performance metrics. Your systems may function adequately now, but they lack the theoretical foundation necessary to ensure reliable performance under all possible conditions. Iris stepped forward, her form shifting to the deep blue patterns that indicated intense analytical focus. Dr. Coldwell, Baker Turner systems have been tested under emergency conditions, high-traffic scenarios, and equipment failure situations. They have demonstrated superior reliability compared to standards-compliant systems. Systems Analyst Iris, empirical performance does not constitute engineering validation. Proper systems must be designed according to established theoretical principles, not adapted from food preparation techniques. Jack realized that Dr. Coldwell was articulating the same institutional resistance to practical knowledge that he'd encountered in other contexts. The assumption that formal credentials were more important than demonstrated results. Dr. Coldwell, what if the formal theoretical principles are the problem? What if they're creating complexity that interferes with system stability? Mr. Turner, theoretical principles exist to ensure that complex systems perform reliably under all conditions. Simplification may appear effective in limited applications, but it lacks the sophistication necessary for critical operations. But sophistication that doesn't work isn't actually sophisticated, it's just complicated. The control center fell, quiet as Jack's statement challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between complexity and effectiveness. Director Stoneweaver was reviewing performance data while processing the debate between regulatory compliance and practical results. Dr. Coldwell, Mr. Turner, both perspectives raise important considerations. However, we must prioritize the safety and effectiveness that serves galactic commerce rather than defending theoretical frameworks. Dr. Coldwell was preparing additional arguments when the control center's emergency alarms activated, indicating a critical situation developing in real time. Multiple system failures on approach Vector 7, announced a technician whose voice carried barely controlled panic. We have a damaged cargo ship with failing engines attempting emergency landing, while a passenger liner is on final approach to the same corridor. Jack watched the main display show two large ships on collision course, with the damaged cargo vessel unable to maintain stable trajectory and the passenger liner committed to a landing approach that couldn't be safely aborted. Emergency protocols activated, Chief Navigator Creelix announced, diverting all traffic from approach Vector 7. The damaged cargo ship cannot maintain stable flight for diversion to alternative approach vectors, reported the system's monitor. Estimated time to structural failure is 4 minutes. Dr. Coldwell moved to the emergency management station with the authority of someone trained in crisis protocols, implementing advanced collision avoidance algorithms and optimized emergency routing systems. For 90 seconds, the control center watched sophisticated software attempt to calculate optimal solutions for an impossible situation. Two large ships, limited time, multiple safety constraints, and no perfect answers. Then the advanced systems crashed under the computational load, leaving the control center with dead screens and two ships heading for collision. Primary systems failure, announced the technician. Collision avoidance algorithms have crashed. Estimated impact in 2 minutes 30 seconds. In the sudden silence that followed this announcement, Jack realized that all the theoretical sophistication in the galaxy was useless if it failed when people needed it most. Iris, can you activate the district system? Baker Turner, the district system is not designed for emergency collision scenarios, but it's designed to handle traffic safely using simple, reliable methods. Can it guide two ships to the same area without them hitting each other? Yes, but not through optimized paths. I don't care about optimized paths. I care about those ships not crashing. Iris activated the simplified navigation system while Dr. Coldwell watched with visible concern about abandoning proper protocols. During a critical emergency, the district system immediately began providing basic guidance to both ships, not optimal routes, but safe routes that accounted for their current positions, speeds, and the damaged cargo ship's limited maneuvering capability. Approach Vector 7 clear for emergency landing, the system announced in simple, clear language. Cargo vessel follow guidance for emergency approach. Passenger liner maintained current trajectory for standard landing sequence. 2 minutes later, both ships were safely on the ground. The control center remained quiet as everyone processed what had just happened. The sophisticated systems had failed when they were needed most, while the simple systems had handled the emergency without difficulty. Dr. Coldwell, Jack said quietly, watching the successful emergency landing replay on the control center displays. Sometimes the most important thing about a system isn't how sophisticated it is. It's whether it works when people's lives depend on it. Dr. Coldwell stood frozen at the emergency management station, staring at the screens that showed 2 ships safely landed while his advanced systems remained crashed and unresponsive. The theoretical principles failed, he said finally, his voice carrying a tone of professional bewilderment that Jack had never heard from a regulatory official. The theoretical principles assumed perfect conditions and unlimited processing time, Iris observed with characteristic analytical precision. Baker Turner's methodology succeeded because it prioritized functional outcomes over computational elegance. Director Stormweaver was reviewing the emergency response data with expressions that shifted between amazement and concern. Mr. Turner, your systems handled a near impossible scenario that our most advanced software couldn't process. Because my systems weren't trying to find the perfect solution. They were trying to find a solution that worked with the time and resources available. Chief Navigator Creelix was coordinating the post-emergency protocols while monitoring the ongoing performance of Jack's district-based navigation system, which had seamlessly returned to normal operations after resolving the crisis. Colleagues, this incident demonstrates that Mr. Turner's methodology provides superior crisis response capabilities compared to our previous approaches. Dr. Coldwell moved away from the failed emergency systems with visible reluctance to acknowledge what everyone had witnessed. Mr. Turner, I must admit that your approach achieved results that regulatory compliance systems could not match. However, I remain concerned about implementing non-standard methodologies without proper theoretical validation. Jack looked at the regulatory official with understanding rather than frustration. Dr. Coldwell, what if theoretical validation isn't what makes systems safe? What if practical testing and real-world reliability are better measures of whether something should be trusted? But without theoretical frameworks, how do we predict system behavior under conditions that haven't been previously encountered? The same way, bakers have been adapting recipes for thousands of years by understanding basic principles well enough to modify them when conditions change. Iris was documenting the emergency response performance while processing the implications of Jack's perspective on adaptive methodology. Dr. Coldwell, Baker Turner's approach represents empirical validation through continuous real-world testing rather than theoretical validation through mathematical modeling. But empirical validation cannot account for all possible scenarios. Neither can theoretical validation, Jack replied. The difference is that empirical validation teaches you how to adapt when you encounter scenarios you haven't seen before, while theoretical validation assumes you can predict all possible scenarios in advance. The control center remained quiet as this fundamental disagreement about problem-solving methodology settled over the assembled officials and technicians. Director Stormweaver consulted her evaluation documentation while observing the ongoing traffic management that continued to function flawlessly under Jack's systems. Mr. Turner, Dr. Coldwell, both approaches raise valid considerations. However, this facility's performance record suggests that practical effectiveness should be our primary concern. Director Stormweaver, Dr. Coldwell said with the formal tone of someone invoking regulatory authority, I must officially recommend against galaxy-wide implementation of non-compliant systems, regardless of their apparent effectiveness at this single facility. Jack felt the familiar weight of institutional resistance to practical solutions that didn't fit established frameworks. Dr. Coldwell, what would it take for you to consider that maybe the compliance frameworks are the problem, not the solutions, that work despite not fitting those frameworks? Mr. Turner, regulatory frameworks exist to ensure safety and reliability across diverse conditions and applications. Individual success stories cannot override systemic safety requirements. But What if the systemic safety requirements are actually making systems less safe by forcing them to be more complicated than they need to be? The question hung in the air as Dr. Coldwell struggled to process a challenge to the fundamental assumptions underlying his professional expertise. Iris stepped forward with data displays showing comparative performance metrics between the old systems and Jack's approach. Dr. Coldwell observed these statistical comparisons. Baker-Turner's methodology has achieved 89% improvement in system stability, 67% reduction in critical failures, and 100% success rate in emergency scenarios. How do regulatory compliance requirements justify rejecting demonstrated superior performance? Because individual performance metrics do not guarantee universal applicability. Systems that work well in one environment may fail catastrophically when implemented elsewhere without proper theoretical foundation. Jack realized that Dr. Coldwell was articulating a legitimate concern about scaling practical solutions to broader applications. Dr. Coldwell, you're right that what works here might not work everywhere else. But that's exactly why you can't standardize solutions. You have to standardize principles and then adapt them to local conditions. Explain the distinction, Mr. Turner. Instead of creating universal protocols that everyone has to follow exactly, you teach people the underlying principles of system stability and let them figure out how to apply those principles to their specific situations. But that approach requires trusting individual implementers to make correct adaptations without centralized oversight. Right. It requires trusting that people who work with systems every day understand those systems better than regulators who only see them on inspection reports. The control center fell quiet as Jack's statement challenged the basic premise of regulatory oversight. Director Stormweaver was consulting with her technical staff while observing the continued smooth operation of traffic management systems that violated regulatory standards but consistently outperformed compliant alternatives. Mr. Turner, your approach raises significant questions about how we balance local expertise with systemic oversight. Director, maybe the balance is wrong. Maybe we've been so focused on preventing bad implementations that we've also prevented good innovations. Dr. Coldwell was reviewing performance data with expressions of professional conflict between regulatory duty and empirical evidence. Mr. Turner, even accepting your methodology's effectiveness at this facility, galaxy-wide implementation would require training programs, oversight mechanisms, and quality assurance protocols that ensure consistent results. Which brings us right back to the same problem, trying to control outcomes through standardization instead of enabling outcomes through education and support. Jack looked around the control center at the technicians who had learned to work with his systems, adapting bread-making principles to navigation challenges in ways he could never have anticipated. Dr. Coldwell, the people here didn't succeed because they followed my exact instructions. They succeeded because they understood the principles well enough to make them work in their specific situation. But without standardized protocols, how do we ensure that other facilities will achieve similar success rather than catastrophic failure? The same way people have been learning complex skills for thousands of years through mentorship, practice, and gradual development of expertise. Iris was processing this discussion while monitoring system performance that continued to demonstrate the effectiveness of Jack's adaptive methodology. Dr. Coldwell, Baker-Turner is proposing distributed expertise development rather than centralized protocol enforcement, which represents a fundamental change in how we approach galactic infrastructure management. Director Stormweaver consulted her communication devices as reports arrived from other facilities requesting information about Nexus Prime's unprecedented performance improvements. Colleagues, we are receiving inquiries from 47 facilities across the galaxy requesting implementation of Mr. Turner's methodology. Clearly, the demand for these improvements exists throughout our network. But demand for results does not eliminate the risks associated with non-standard implementations. Dr. Coldwell cautioned. Jack realized that the conversation had reached a critical decision point about how to balance innovation with institutional safety. Dr. Coldwell, Director Stormweaver, what if we tested the approach at a small number of volunteer facilities first? Let people who want to try the methodology work with us to adapt it to their conditions, while maintaining standard systems at facilities that prefer regulatory compliance. Dr. Coldwell was considering this compromise with visible internal conflict between safety concerns and empirical evidence. Mr. Turner, limited pilot implementation could provide data about scalability while minimizing systemic risks, and it would let us learn how to teach the principles effectively instead of just trying to impose standardized procedures. Director Stormweaver was coordinating with her technical staff while processing the implications of pilot testing Jack's methodology across multiple facilities. Mr. Turner, Dr. Coldwell, pilot implementation represents a reasonable approach to evaluating broader applicability while maintaining appropriate oversight. As the discussion continued, Jack realized that his bread-making wisdom was about to be tested not just at one spaceport, but across multiple facilities throughout the galaxy, each facing unique challenges that would require adaptive solutions. Rather than standardized procedures, the principles that had guided his family's baking for generations were evolving into a new approach to managing complex systems through understanding, adaptation, and trust in local expertise, rather than rigid adherence to universal protocols. 6 months later, Jack found himself in the most unlikely meeting of his life, a galactic conference, featuring representatives from 12 spaceports that had successfully implemented variations of his bread-making approach to navigation systems. But what struck him most wasn't the technical success stories being shared. It was how differently each facility had adapted the principles to their unique circumstances. Commander Vex Tai, from the Regelian Commercial Hub, stood before a display showing their traffic management system, which had incorporated Jack's stability principles into their existing crystalline computing architecture. The human baker's methodology required complete reconstruction of our approach to system complexity, she announced to the assembled representatives. Instead of optimizing individual processing nodes, we focused on creating stable relationships between system components. Jack listened with amazement as the Regelian commander described solutions he never could have imagined, using his bread-making principles to coordinate crystalline computers that function through harmonic resonance rather than digital processing. Commander Vex Tai asked Director Volroth from the Andromedan Research Station, "How did you adapt biological fermentation concepts to crystalline architecture?" By understanding that Baker Turner's principles were not about biology, but about managing stable systems through minimal intervention and respect for natural processes. Our crystals have their own optimal operating conditions, and forcing them beyond those parameters creates instability. Engineer Takavar from Centauri Prime was presenting their adaptation, which had applied Jack's district-based organization to their modular station design. Rather than attempting to coordinate all station systems through centralized control, we implemented autonomous district management with basic inter-district communication protocols. The result has been 78% reduction in system conflicts and near elimination of cascading failures. Jack was fascinated to see how his simple idea about dividing navigation space into districts had evolved into a sophisticated approach to managing modular space stations that he barely understood technically, but recognized immediately in terms of underlying principles. Dr. Coldwell, who had become an unexpected advocate for adaptive methodology after witnessing months of successful implementations, was documenting the variations with professional amazement. Colleagues, these reports demonstrate that Mr. Turner's principles have been successfully adapted to 12 different technological architectures, environmental conditions, and operational requirements without standardized implementation protocols. Iris, who had become Jack's primary collaborator in developing training approaches for other facilities, was analyzing the performance data with characteristic analytical thoroughness. The statistical evidence confirms that facilities implementing Baker Turner's principles have achieved superior performance compared to regulatory compliant alternatives, despite or perhaps because of the lack of standardized procedures. But the presentation that affected Jack most deeply came from systems operator Quindle from the Outer Rim Trading Post, whose facility served primarily independent traders, refugee families, and frontier communities. Baker Turner's methodology succeeded at our facility not because of technical improvements, but because it taught us to care about the people using our systems, rather than just optimizing system performance. Jack listened as Quindle described how adopting bread-making principles had led their facility to recognize that many of their technical problems were actually human problems: refugees who didn't understand navigation procedures, independent traders using outdated equipment, families traveling with children who needed different types of assistance. We discovered that the most important system optimization was helping people succeed rather than forcing people to adapt to our systems. The conference continued with technical presentations and performance analyses, but Jack found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Iris months earlier about the difference between optimizing systems and caring for systems. During a break in the presentations, Jack approached Quindle to learn more about their people-focused adaptations. Systems operator Quindle, can you tell me more about how caring for people improved your technical performance? Aker Turner, when we stopped trying to force users to comply with optimal procedures and started helping them achieve their goals. Using our systems, we eliminated most of our operational conflicts. What kind of conflicts? Traffic delays caused by operators who didn't understand complex routing instructions. System errors caused by incompatible equipment. Emergency situations caused by users who couldn't communicate their problems clearly. Jack realized that Quindle was describing the same insight that had guided his approach to customer service in the bakery. That understanding what people actually needed was more important than following standard procedures. So instead of trying to make your systems more sophisticated, you made them more helpful. We made them more responsive to the humans and aliens who depend on them. The technical improvements followed naturally from that priority change. As the conference continued, Jack began to see a pattern in all the successful adaptations. They had succeeded not just by implementing his technical principles, but by adopting his fundamental approach of caring about the well-being of the people and systems involved. The Regelians had learned to respect their crystalline computers' natural operating characteristics. The Andromedans had focused on supporting their researchers' actual work patterns rather than forcing them to adapt to optimal procedures. The Centauri engineers had created systems that helped their diverse communities succeed rather than requiring universal compliance. During the final session, Director Stormweaver presented the overall results from the pilot implementation program. 12 facilities, representing 8 different species technological approaches, serving diverse communities across 47 star systems, have achieved consistent improvements in safety, efficiency, and user satisfaction through adaptation of principles originally developed for bread making. But the most significant discovery, she continued, is that these improvements were achieved not through standardization, but through local adaptation, guided by universal principles of system care and user support. Dr. Coldwell, whose transformation from regulatory skeptic to adaptive methodology advocate had surprised everyone, presented his final assessment. This pilot program has demonstrated that effective galactic infrastructure management requires trusting local expertise while providing supportive oversight, rather than enforcing standardized compliance while providing punitive oversight. Jack stood before the assembled representatives, realizing that his simple desire to make good bread and help travelers feel at home had evolved into a new approach to managing complex systems throughout the galaxy. Colleagues, I want to thank everyone who took the risk of trying something different. You've shown that the principles my family learned through generations of baking can help people solve problems I never imagined. But the most important thing you've demonstrated is that caring about the people and systems you work with is not separate from technical competence. It's what makes technical competence actually useful. The conference concluded with the establishment of the Galactic Adaptive Systems Network, a collaborative organization focused on supporting facilities that wanted to develop locally adapted solutions guided by universal principles of system care and user support. As Jack prepared to return to Nexus Prime, he realized that his family's bread-making wisdom had become part of a galaxy-wide movement toward more humane and effective approaches to managing complex technology. But more importantly, he had learned that the most powerful solutions emerged when people were willing to combine their different types of expertise in service of shared goals rather than trying to prove that their individual approaches were superior. 1 year after the Galactic Conference, Jack was in his bakery at Nexus Prime, teaching his morning bread-making class to a group that would have seemed impossible before his collaboration with Iris began. 3 Zephyrian systems analysts, 2 Rigelian engineers, an Andromedan research coordinator, and a dozen human technicians were learning to make sourdough bread as part of their professional development in adaptive systems management. The starter is ready when it doubles in size and passes the float test, Jack explained, demonstrating how a spoonful of active culture would float in water. But more importantly, you can tell by the smell and the way it moves. Experience teaches you things that measurements can't capture. Engineer Takavar, who had attended the conference as a skeptic and returned home to implement one of the most successful adaptations, was documenting the fermentation process with the same analytical intensity he brought to space station design. Baker Turner, this biological system demonstrates the same principles that have improved our modular architecture, autonomous components working together through simple communication protocols rather than centralized control. Right, but it also demonstrates something else, that you have to pay attention to what's actually happening instead of just following predetermined procedures. Iris, who had become the unofficial coordinator of the Galactic Adaptive Systems Network, was observing the bread-making lesson while simultaneously managing interstellar communications about new facility implementations. Baker Turner, we have received requests for adaptive methodology consultation from 37 additional facilities across 17 star systems. That's wonderful, Iris. Are you finding that the principles are translating well to different types of operations? The principles are translating perfectly. The challenge is helping people understand that adaptation requires local expertise, development rather than imported solutions. Jack looked around his bakery classroom at beings from across the galaxy who were learning that bread making was simultaneously a technical process requiring precision and a caring process requiring attention to living systems. Iris, I think the most important thing we've learned is that you can't separate technical skills from caring skills. They work together to create solutions that actually help people. Systems coordinator Quindle, whose people-focused approach had become a model for other facilities, was visiting Nexus Prime to observe Jack's training methods. Baker Turner, your classroom demonstrates the same principle that transformed our facility, that learning happens through practice and mentorship rather than instruction and compliance. What do you mean? Watch your students. They are not just learning procedures for bread making. They are developing intuition about biological systems, patience with slow processes, and attention to subtle changes that indicate system health. Jack observed his diverse class of students, noting that the bread-making process was teaching them skills that directly applied to their technical work, but couldn't be learned through traditional training programs. You're right, Quindle. They're learning to recognize healthy systems, diagnose problems early, and respond appropriately to changing conditions. Dr. Coldwell, who had become an unexpected regular visitor to Jack's bakery, entered the classroom carrying reports from the latest Galactic Infrastructure Performance Assessment. Mr. Turner, colleagues, I have data that will interest you. He activated a holographic display showing performance metrics from facilities across the galaxy, comparing those using adaptive methodology with those maintaining regulatory compliance. Facilities implementing adaptations of Mr. Turner's principles show 91% average improvement in system stability, 73% reduction in critical failures, and 84% improvement in user satisfaction ratings. But more significantly, Dr. Coldwell continued, these facilities have demonstrated superior performance during crisis situations, suggesting that adaptive methodology produces more resilient systems rather than just more efficient systems. Jack paused in his bread instruction to consider the implications of Dr. Coldwell's data. Dr. Coldwell, what do you think accounts for the crisis resilience? The same factor that enabled your systems to handle the emergency landing situation. Adaptive methodology teaches people to respond effectively to unexpected conditions rather than just optimizing performance under predicted conditions. Iris was coordinating communication with facilities throughout the galaxy while simultaneously monitoring the sourdough culture that she had been maintaining for 6 months. Baker Turner. The network is reporting that adaptive methodology success depends primarily on local leadership commitment to system care principles rather than technical sophistication of implementation. That makes sense. You can't care for systems through procedures. You have to develop relationships with the systems and the people who use them. As the bread-making lesson continued, Jack realized that his bakery had become something he'd never anticipated, an educational center where beings from across the galaxy learned that the most advanced technology worked best when managed by people who combined technical competence with genuine care for the systems and communities they served. Chief Navigator Creolix arrived during the afternoon bread cooling period, carrying a communication that made Jack's transformation from neighborhood baker to galactic consultant official. Baker Turner, I have a formal request from the Galactic Infrastructure Council. What kind of request? They are offering you the position of Chief Advisor for Adaptive Systems Methodology, with responsibility for supporting implementation throughout the known galaxy. Jack looked around his bakery, with its traditional ovens, its centuries-old sourdough culture, and its daily community of travelers seeking bread that reminded them of home. Chief Navigator, I'm honored by the offer, but I think I can serve the galaxy better by staying here and continuing to teach people that the most sophisticated solutions are often the ones that combine advanced knowledge with traditional wisdom. Baker Turner, are you declining the position? I'm suggesting that the position should be distributed among the people who have learned to adapt these principles to their local conditions, rather than centralized with someone who understands bread making, but not crystalline computers or modular space stations. Iris was documenting this conversation while tending to her own sourdough starter, which had become a symbol of her transformation from pure analyst to systems caretaker. Baker Turner's proposal represents perfect application of adaptive methodology. Principles distributed expertise with supportive coordination rather than centralized control. As word of Jack's decision spread throughout the network, facilities across the galaxy began implementing their own versions of distributed advisory systems, creating a collaborative approach to infrastructure management that combined local expertise with shared principles. 6 months later, Jack received a final report from Dr. Coldwell showing that the galaxy's transportation infrastructure had achieved unprecedented levels of safety, efficiency, and user satisfaction through adaptive methodology implemented by local experts who understood both their technological systems and their communities. But the report that meant the most to Jack came from Iris, whose analytical precision had learned to incorporate care and attention in ways that made her one of the galaxy's most effective systems coordinators. Baker Turner, the network has documented that facilities implementing adaptive methodology have created more than improved technical performance. They have created work environments where beings from diverse species collaborate more effectively, communities where travelers feel more welcomed, and systems that serve people rather than requiring people to serve systems. As Jack continued his daily routine of feeding sourdough cultures, baking bread for homesick travelers, and teaching anyone who wanted to learn that caring for systems was inseparable from technical competence, he realized that his family's bread-making wisdom had contributed to something larger than improved navigation software. It had helped create a galaxy where advanced technology served to connect communities rather than replace human connections, where expertise was valued for its ability to help others rather than demonstrate superiority, and where the most sophisticated solutions emerge from combining traditional wisdom with contemporary knowledge in service of shared well-being. Sometimes, the most important revolutions began in the most ordinary places, carried out by people who simply cared enough to do their work well and share what they learned with anyone willing to listen.